Introduction, Lemma 2 of Social Statics by Herbert Spencer. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Craig Franklin. Social Statics, or the conditions essential to human happiness, specified, and the first of them developed, by Herbert Spencer. Introduction, Lemma 2. And yet, unable as the imperfect man may be to fulfil the perfect law, there is no other law for him. One right course only is open, and he must either follow that or take the consequences. The conditions of existence will not bend before his perversity, nor relax in consideration of his weakness. Neither, when they are broken, may any exception from the penalties be hoped for. Obey or suffer are the ever-repeated alternatives. Disobedience is sure to be convicted, and there are no reprieves. It is indeed the favourite maxim of a certain popular philosophy that there is no rule without an exception, a maxim about as respectable as the proverbs along with which it commonly passes current. Applied to conventional usages, to the tenets of state policy, to social regulations, to the precepts of pocket prudence, to the laws of grammar, of art, of etiquette, or to those common aphorisms which roughly classify the experience of everyday life, it may be true enough. But if affirmed of the essential principles of things, of society, of man, it is utterly false. Nature's rules, on the contrary, have no exceptions. The apparent ones are only apparent, not real. They are indications either that we have not found the true law, or that we have got an imperfect expression of it. Thus, if terrestrial gravitation be defined as a tendency possessed by all free bodies to descend towards the centre of the earth, you may triumphantly add, all free bodies except the balloon. But your balloon is no exception. Its ascent is just as much a result of gravitation as the falling of a stone. You have merely proved that the definition does not adequately express the law. Again, to the assertion that exercise increases strength, you may answer that, although generally true, it is not true of invalids, to whom exercise is often detrimental, and that it is only true of the healthy within certain limits. Just so. But such qualifications would have been needless if the law had been completely stated. Had it been said that, so long as the power of assimilation is sufficient to make good the waste consequent upon exercise, exercise increases strength, no limitations could have been discovered. The so-called exceptions are in ourselves, not in nature. They show either that the law eludes our perception or baffles our power of expression. Rightly understood, the progress from the deepest ignorance to the highest enlightenment is a progress from entire unconsciousness of law to the conviction that law is universal and inevitable. Accumulating knowledge and continual induction are ever restricting the old ideas of special causation within narrower limits. Each new discovery in science, every anomaly solved, strengthens men in the belief that phenomena result from general uniform forces, and at length, by dint of constantly repeated evidence, they begin to perceive that there are no suspensions of these forces even for the avoidance of the most terrific catastrophes. They see that although fleets be sent to the bottom by the resulting storm, yet must atmospheric equilibrium be restored. They see that the earth does not cease its attraction, even to save a village from the impending avalanche. They see that, regardless of the consequent destruction of a church or blowing up of a vessel, the electric fluid will still follow the line of least resistance. They see that chemical affinity must act, notwithstanding it ends in the burning of a city to ashes, in the submergence of half a country by volcanic disturbance, or in the loss of 100,000 lives by an epidemic. Every increment of knowledge goes to show that constancy is an essential attribute of the divine rule, an unvaryingness which renders the eclipse of 100 years hence predicable to a moment. and for the end of these unbending ordinances of nature, we find it to be the universal good. To render the world habitable, that is the great object. The minor evils due to this persistency of action are as nothing compared with the infinite benefits secured. Whether those evils might or might not have been avoided, we need not now consider. It is enough for us to know that constancy is the law, and we have no alternative but to assume that law to be the best possible one. Section 2. As with the physical, so with the ethical. A belief as yet fitful and partial is beginning to spread amongst men that, here also, there is an indissoluble bond between cause and consequence, an inexorable destiny, a law which altereth not. Confounded by the multiplied and the ever newer aspects of human affairs, it is not perhaps surprising that men should fail duly to recognise the systematic character of the divine rule. Yet in the moral, as in the material world, accumulated evidence is gradually generating the conviction that events are not at bottom fortuitous, but they are wrought out in a certain inevitable way by unchanging forces. In all ages, there has been some glimmering perception of this truth, and experience is ever giving to that perception increased distinctness. Indeed, even now all men do, in one mode or other, testify of such a faith. Every known creed is an assertion of it. What are the moral codes of the Mahometan, the Brahmin, the Buddhist, but so many acknowledgments of the inseparable connection between the conduct and its results? Do they not all say, you shall not do this and this, because they will produce evil, and you shall do that and that, because they will produce good? No matter that their founders erred in the attempt to refer each effect to its special cause, and so botched their system of morality, notwithstanding this, they evince the belief that there is an inevitable law of causation in human affairs, which it is for man to learn and conform to. And is not this the doctrine of the highest known religion? Does not Christianity also teach that such and such deeds shall surely end in such and such issues, evil-doing in punishment, well-doing in reward, and that these things are necessarily and indissolubly connected? We imply such a faith too in our everyday conversations, in our maxims and our precepts, in our education of children, in our advice to friends. In judging men and things, we instinctively refer them to some standard of ascertained principles. We predict good or evil of this or the other scheme, because of its accordance or discordance with certain perceived laws of life. Nay, even the petty-fogging red tapist, with his hand-to-mouth expediency and professed contempt for abstract principles, has really a secret consciousness of some such invariable sequence of events, does really believe in the sway of that beneficent necessity, which to a given act attaches a fixed result. For what is the true meaning of his measures, his projects of law? He does not think of it as a toss-up, whether this or that effect will be produced by them. If he did, he would be as ready to adopt one plan as another. Evidently, he sees that there are constant influences at work, which from each circumstance or set of circumstances educe an unavoidable consequence, and that under like conditions, like events, will again follow. Surely then, if all believe in the persistency of these secondary laws, much more should they believe in the persistency of those primary ones, which underlie human existence, and out of which our everyday truths grow. We cannot deny the root if we recognise the branches, and if such is the constitution of things, we are compelled to admit this same beneficent necessity. There is no alternative. Either society has laws, or it has not. If it has not, there can be no order, no certainty, no system in its phenomena. If it has, then are they like the other laws of the universe, sure, inflexible, ever active, and having no exceptions. Section 3. How infinitely important is it that we should ascertain what these laws are, and having ascertained, implicitly obey them? If they really exist, then only by submission to them can anything permanently succeed. Just in so far as it complies with the principles of moral equilibrium can it stand. Our social edifice may be constructed with all possible labour and ingenuity, and be strongly cramped together with cunningly devised enactments. But if there be no rectitude in its component parts, if it is not built on upright principles, it will assuredly tumble to pieces. As well might we seek to light a fire with ice, feed cattle on stones, hang our hats on cobwebs, or otherwise disregard the physical laws of the world, as go contrary to its equally imperative ethical laws. Yes, but there are exceptions, say you. We cannot always be strictly guided by abstract principles. Prudential considerations must have some weight. It is necessary to use a little policy. Very specious, no doubt, are your reasons for advocating this or the other exception. But if there be any truth in the foregoing argument, no infraction of the law can be made with impunity. Those cherished schemes by which you proposed to attain some desired good by a little politic disobedience are all delusive. Were anyone to tell you that he had invented a mechanical combination which doubled power without diminishing velocity, or that he had discovered the quadrature of the circle so that he knew the receipt for the philosopher's stone, or that he could sell you a child's cowl which would save you from drowning, you would reply that, whilst there were laws of matter, such things could not be, that they were proved impossibilities. Exactly so. But rest satisfied that they are not more complete impossibilities than are your proposed achievements, which similarly conflict with the essential laws of life. It may indeed be difficult for those who have but little faith in the invisible to follow out a principle unflinchingly, in spite of every threatening evil, to give up their own power of judging what seems best from the belief that that only is best which is abstractly right, to say, although appearances are against it, yet will I obey the law. Nevertheless, this is the true attitude to assume, the conduct which it has been the object of all moral teaching to inculcate, the only conduct which can eventually answer. Footnote. Coleridge clearly expresses such a belief. He says this is indeed the main characteristics of the moral system taught by the Friend throughout, that the distinct foresight of consequences belongs exclusively to the infinite wisdom which is one with the almighty will, on which all consequences depend, but that for man to obey the simple unconditional command of eschewing every act that implies a self-contradiction, or in other words, to produce and maintain the greatest possible harmony in the component impulses and faculties of his nature, involves the effects of prudence. From the Friend. End of footnote. Section 4. Even supposing for a moment that a solitary act of disobedience may pass without evil results, nay, may bring beneficial ones, even supposing this, the wisdom of the act is not thereby proved. For consider the probable effects of a wrong precedent. As Paley truly says, the bad consequences of actions are twofold, particular and general, and admitting even that a particular good has been secured, a far greater general evil has been entailed by opening the way to future disobedience. There is no security in this lax creed. One breach of the law leaves a gap for numberless subsequent trespasses. If the first false step has been taken with seeming impunity, it will inevitably be followed by others. Schoolboy promises of only this once are not to be believed. Make a hole through a principle to admit a solitary exception, and on one pretence or another so many other exceptions will by and by be thrust through after it, as to render the principle utterly good for nothing. In fact, if its consequences are closely traced, this same plea for licence in special cases turns out to be the source of nearly all the evils that inflict us. Almost every wrongdoing is excused by the doer on this ground. He confesses his act is at variance with the moral law, which he admits to be, and in some sort believes to be, the best guide. He thinks, however, that his interest requires him now and then to make exceptions. All men do this, and see the result.
Section 5.
But can we ever be sure that an exceptional disobedience will bring the anticipated benefits? Whoso would forsake for a time a confessedly legitimate guide should remember that he is falling back upon the expediency hypothesis, of which we have already seen the falsity. He is laying claim to a perfect knowledge of a man, of society, of institutions, of events, of all the complex, ever-varying phenomena of human existence, and to a grasp of mind that can infer from these how things will go in future. In short, he is assuming that same omniscience which, as we saw, is requisite for the successful carrying out of such a system. Does he shrink from aggregating as much? Then observe his dilemma. He deserts what he admits to be on the whole a safe rule of conduct, to follow one which is difficult to understand, unsettled in its directions, doubtful in its consequences. If the foolishness of such conduct needs illustrating by facts, there are plenty at hand. The constant failure of schemes devised without consulting ethical principles has been already exemplified. See page 8. Let us now, however, take a few cases specially applying to the present point, cases in which benefit has been sought by going in palpable opposition to those principles, cases in which men, dissatisfied with the road whose finger-post declares that honesty is the best policy, have diverged into the byways of injustice in the hope of more readily attaining their ends. The enslavement of the negroes serves for a good example. Nothing could have seemed more conclusive than the reasoning of unscrupulous colonists on this matter. Here were rich soils, a splendid climate, and a large market for the sale of produce. Now, could but a sufficiency of labour be imported and reduced to servitude, what profit they would bring to their possessors. Maintained at a cheap rate, made to work hard, and to keep long at it, what a surplus would they not create? Here was a mine of wealth. Well, the planters acted at their thought, did that which, although it might not be just, was apparently the best policy, so far as they were concerned. Their golden visions have been far from realised, however. Slave countries are comparatively poverty-stricken all over the world. Though Jamaica at one time sent us a few overgrown nabobs, yet West Indian history has been a history of distress and complaining, in spite of continual assistance and artificial advantages. The southern states of America are far behind their northern neighbours in prosperity, are in process of abandoning slavery one after another, in consequence of its ruinous result. Somehow, the scheme has not answered as was expected. Though working, in some cases, 16 hours out of 24, though supported on a pint of flour and 1 salt herring per day, though kept to his work by whips, yet did not the slave bring to his owner the larger profit calculated upon. Indeed, it has turned out that, under like circumstances, free labour is much cheaper. And then, besides the disappointment, there came results that were never looked for. Slavery brought in its train the multiple curses of a diseased social state, a reign of mutual hatred and terror, of universal demoralisation, of sin-begotten recklessness, of extravagant expenditure, of bad cultivation, exhausted soils, mortgaged estates, bankruptcy, beggary. After all, the moral law would have been the safest guide. When Philip of Valois swore the officers of his mint to conceal the debasement of the coinage, and to endeavour to make the merchants believe that the gold and silver pieces were of full value, he thought that although perhaps unprincipled, such a measure would be vastly profitable, and so no doubt believed that the other kings who, in the good old times, almost universally did the like. They overreached themselves, however, as all such schemers do. It is true that their debts were diminished in proportion to the reduction in the value of the currency, but their revenues were at the same time reduced in the like ratio. Moreover, the loss of their reputation for honesty made them afterwards unable to borrow money, except at proportionately higher rates of interest, to cover the risk ran by the lender. So they had not only lost on the creditor side of the accounts what they had gained on the debtor side, but put themselves at a great disadvantage for the future. After centuries of dearly bought experience, the practice was reluctantly abandoned and is now universally exploded as essentially suicidal. Just as suicidal, in fact, as all other infringements of the rule of right. Let us remember also the failure of those attempts to profit at the expense of our American colonies, and the disastrous results to which they led. Our governors thought it would be highly beneficial to the mother country if the colonies were constrained to become her customers, and in pursuance of this conclusion not only prohibited the settlers from purchasing certain goods from any other country than England, but actually denied them the right to make those goods for themselves. As usual, the manoeuvre proved worse than abortive. The outlay required to keep open this national truck shop was greater than the receipts. Nay, indeed, that outlay was wholly thrown away, and worse than thrown away, for it turns out that artificial trades so obtained entail loss upon both parties. Then, too, came the punishment, the resistance of the settlers, the war of independence, and the 100-odd millions added to our national burdens. What an astounding illustration of the defeat of dishonesty by the eternal laws of things we have in the history of the East India Company. Selfish, unscrupulous, worldly wise in policy, and with unlimited force to back it, this oligarchy year by year perseveringly carried out its scheme of aggrandizement. It subjugated province upon province. It laid one prince after another under tribute. It made exorbitant demands upon adjacent rulers, and construed refusals into a pretext for aggression. It became sole proprietor of the land, claiming nearly one half the produce as rent, and it entirely monopolised commerce, thus uniting in itself the character of conqueror, ruler, landowner, and merchant. With all these resources, what could it be but prosperous? From the spoils of victorious war, the rent of millions of acres, the tribute of dependent monarchs, the profits of an exclusive trade, what untold wealth must have poured in upon it, what revenues, what a bursting exchequer. Alas, the company is some 50 million in debt. Protected trades, too, have afforded many proofs of the impolicy of injustice. The history of the wool business some centuries ago might be quoted as one, but let us take the more recent case of silk. Under the now happily exploded plea of protection to native industry, the silk manufacturers were freed from all foreign competition. Their prices were thus artificially raised, and all the nation was compelled to buy of them. And so, having a large market and high profits, they thought their prosperity ensured. They were doomed to disappointment, however. Instead of a brisk and extensive trade, they obtained a languishing and confined one, and that branch of manufacture which was to have been a pattern of commercial greatness became a byword for whining poverty. How utterly absurd, under such a lamentable state of things, must have appeared the proposal to return towards equitable dealing by lowering the duties. What impracticables must those men have been thought who, because monopoly was unjust, wished to expose the almost ruined manufacturers to the additional difficulty of foreign competition? Could anything be more contrary to common sense? Here surely was a case in which abstract principles must give way to policy. No, even here, too, obedience to the moral law proved to be the best. Rebellion against it had been punished by accumulated distresses. A partial submission was rewarded by an increase of prosperity. Within 14 years from the date at which the duties were lowered, the trade had more than doubled itself, had increased more within that period than during the preceding century. And those who, but a short time before, were unable to meet their French compeers in the home markets, not only began to compete with them in the marts of their own nation, but to send large quantities of goods to France itself. These are but a few examples from a universal experience. If diligently traced, the results of abandoning the right to pursue the politic will uniformly be found to end thus. Men who are insane enough to think that they may safely violate the fundamental laws of right conduct may read in such defeats and disasters their own fate. Let them but inquire, and they will find that each petty evil, each great catastrophe, is in some way or other a sequence of injustice. Monetary panics, South Sea bubbles, railway manias, Irish rebellions, French revolutions. These, and the miseries flowing from them, are but the cumulative effects of dishonesty. A bitter experience teaches all men, when it is too late, that, alike in national and individual affairs, entire submission is the wisest course. Even Napoleon, after his seeming success, his triumphs, his profound statesmanship, his far-seeing policy, ended in the belief that there is no power without justice. Yet this commentary on the moral code, this history as we call it, men forever read in vain. Poring with microscopic eye over the symbols in which it is written, they are heedless of the great facts expressed by them. Instead of collecting evidence bearing upon the all-important questions, what are the laws that determine national success or failure, stability or revolution? They gossip about state intrigues, sieges and battles, court scandals and crimes of nobles, the quarrels of parties, the births, deaths and marriages of kings, and other like trifles. Minutiae, pettifogging details, the vanity and frippery of bygone times, the mere decorations of the web of existence, they examine, analyse, and learnedly descant upon, yet are blind to those stern realities which each age shrouds in its superficial tissues of events, those terrible truths which glare out from us from the gloom of the past, from the successive strata of our historical deposits. They diligently gather all the highly coloured fragments, pounce upon everything that is curious and sparkling, and chuckle like children over their glittering acquisitions. Meanwhile, the rich veins of wisdom that ramify amidst this worthless debris lie utterly neglected. Cumbrous volumes of rubbish are greedily accumulated, while those masses of rich ore that should have been dug out, and from which golden truths might have been smelted, are left unthought and unsought. Section 6. But why all this laboured examination into the propriety or impropriety of making exceptions to an ascertained ethical law? The very question is absurd. For what does a man really mean by saying of a thing that it is theoretically just, or true in principle, or abstractly right? Simply that it accords with what he, in some way or other, perceives to be the established arrangements of divine rule. When he admits that an act is theoretically just, he admits it to be that which in strict duty should be done. By true in principle, he means in harmony with the conduct decreed for us. The course which he calls abstractly right, he believes to be the appointed way to human happiness. There is no escape. The expressions mean this, or they mean nothing. Practically, therefore, when he proposes to disobey, he does so in the hope of improving on this guidance. Though told that such and such are true roads to happiness, he opines that he knows shorter ones. To the Creator's silent command, "Do this," he replies that, all things considered, he thinks he can do better. This is the real infidelity, the true atheism, to doubt the foresight and efficiency of the divine arrangements, and with infinite presumption to suppose a human judgment less fallible. When will man cease his frantic pretensions of scanning this great God's world in its small fraction of a brain, and know that it has verily, though deep beyond his soundings, a just law, that the soul of it is good, that his part in it is to conform to the law of the whole, and in devout silence follow that, not questioning it, obeying it as unquestionable. Footnote. Advice, by the way, which in these latter days the giver might properly enough take home to himself. End of footnote. Section 7. Briefly reviewing the argument, we mark first that physical laws are characterized by constancy and universality, and there is every reason to believe the like true of ethical ones. It is inferred that, if so, there is no safety but in entire obedience, even in spite of threatening appearances. This inference is enforced by the consideration that any departure from principle to escape some anticipated evil is a return to the proved errors of expediency. It is again enforced by the fact that innumerable attempts of a stiff-necked worldly wisdom to benefit by disobedience have failed. And it is yet further enforced by the reflection that to think we can better ourselves by deserting the road marked out for us is an impious assumption of more than divine omniscience. The reasons for thus specially insisting on implicit obedience will become apparent as the reader proceeds. Amongst the conclusions inevitably following from an admitted principle, he will most likely find several for which he is hardly prepared. Some of these will seem strange, others impracticable, and it may be, one or two, wholly at variance with his ideas of duty. Nevertheless, should he find them logically derived from a fundamental truth, he will have no alternative but to adopt them as rules of conduct, which ought to be followed without exception. If there be any weight to the considerations above set forth, then, no matter how seemingly inexpedient, dangerous, injurious even, may be the course which morality points out as abstractly right, the highest wisdom is in perfect and fearless submission. End of introduction. Lemma 2.